Prologue. In for a penny, in for a pound. Time and tide wait for no man. Geoffrey Chaucer, circa 1343 to the 25th of October 1400. A prologue is supposed to be short in heralding the main event, but as this audiobook is now your audiobook, bless you, it might be of value not to skip these first pages in your enthusiastic search of dastardly deeds most foul. The reason, I am about to set the scene for all that is to follow. In for a penny, in for a pound. Taking Chaucer's proverb slightly out of original context, we could, if we were morbidly inclined, apply it to the Grim Reaper. Moreover, even to begin to understand the more recent horrific murders and the psychopathologies of the very few killers employed in today's medical professions, I will invite you on the road again, to travel back through the black annals of medical history to the splendid Victorian era, to cover some medical murderers in depth. There we find that the psychological motivators of past monsters in white coats, crisp, bustling uniforms or scrubs were just the same in bygone times as they are today. Following this, we will bring ourselves more or less up to date and into the minds of the first people we most often see when we open our eyes, too frequently the last when our peepers close forever. Doctors, nurses, and carers. 'Tis a grim subject, indeed, but that is precisely what this audiobook is all about. Yet my listener is guaranteed a whole bunch of smiles along the way, just to lighten the load. Poisons and medicines are often the same substance given with different intents. English physician Peter Mayor Latham, M.D., 1789 to 1875. Intent is motive, is it not? A notable thinker of his time, William Wills, author of An Essay on the Principles of Circumstantial Evidence, illustrated by numerous cases, 1838, remarked, "A man's motives may be good, but his intentions bad. For example, a loaf is stolen. The intention was to steal, the act therefore criminal, although the motive to save a starving child was good." Generally speaking, however, intent and motive are so entwined that quite understandably we might find some difficulty in separating them. In many of the following homicides committed by medically trained individuals, we find the same paradoxes occurring time and again, with some murdering their patients, not for financial gain, but alleging that they are doing the sufferer a favour by putting them out of their misery, as though the intention is good. Ah, this would be euthanasia, I hear you mutter, to which, no, that's not correct, I say. So why do I bring to the table a few historical cases? In truth, they provide an absolute treasure trove of criminological information, with books, records, papers, and trial transcripts about these events being as unique as they are illuminating. These tomes are beautifully crafted. They were written by people who truly knew their stuff, and although some might say that these dusty papers were penned somewhat stiffly by contemporary standards, there is a certain eloquence to be found throughout. I have accumulated a mass of this golden olden-day true crime literature over the decades, which has brought me to the conclusion that yesteryear's evil doctors, nurses, and other medical people harboured the same motives, displayed many of the same 7 deadly sins, and used very much the same methods to dispatch their vulnerable victims as do our medical killers today. By methods, I largely mean, of course, silently using toxic chemicals, for one cannot murder a trusting hospital patient or a visitor to a doctor's surgery using a firearm or an axe. That much is obvious. So I thought, why not use these older case histories as benchmarks to compare the perpetrators with their more recent murderous kin? For in doing so, we might learn much from the past that might perhaps allow us to red flag the likes of nurses Beverly Allett and Stephen Letter, the ilk of parsimonious, obnoxious Dr Shipman, before they strike again. Wishful thinking? Maybe yes, maybe no. Up the close and doon the stair, but on ben wee Birken hare. Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, Knock's the boy that buys the beef. popular song during the period of William Burke's trial in 1829. It would be true to suggest that so socially camouflaged are serial murderers generally that one cannot spot them before they strike. It goes without saying that advertising their murderous intentions would defeat the object of the attack. Another obvious observation, of course. Yet, the killers in this audiobook are flawlessly presentable, striking, not in some damp, dingy alley at night, such as predators Ted Bundy or Peter Sutcliffe. Oh, no. All but one of the medical monsters included within these pages sat by their patients' bedsides, offering comfort and reassurance, while hiding a dark, hidden agenda, to kill by plying their victims with lethal doses of strychnine or injections of morphia or a pillow pressed down hard, or pinching the nose, forcing the mouth shut while kneeling on the patient's chest, the technique known as burking. This was the favoured method of murdering used by William Burke and William Hare, who in 1828 sold corpses to Dr Robert Knox for dissection at his anatomy lectures in Edinburgh. Nursing aides Gwendolyn Graham and Cathy Maywood, both of whom I previously interviewed in 1984 in their respective prisons and have written about before, also burked their elderly, frail prey while on night duty at the Alpine Manor Nursing Home in Walker, a suburb of Grand Rapids, Michigan, in 1987. So straight away, we see parallels here with suffocation as a way to extinguish life. An analogy of sorts. My other reason for including notable historical cases in this audiobook is that the passage of time seemingly numbs the shock horror of the loss of loved ones. The heartache and grief, the neatly clipped grass over deep graves with their sides falling in under cold headstones. The mournful processions and sad eulogies endured by families and friends back then were just as tragic as they are today. Therefore, we must not dismiss their sad histories just because they have been reduced to yellowing paper, the ink slowly fading away. Indeed, we can learn much from their deaths, for they still whisper to us from their tombs, as do those medical killers screaming in terror as they plunge through the hangman's trap, and afterwards stiffly thrown into a pit of slaked lime behind grim prison walls. During our road trip in quest of murderous medics, I follow the deaths of these earlier victims and the motives of their murderers as would a medical examiner at the autopsy of someone who will be far, far longer dead than they ever were alive. The forensic pathologist is the detective of death. The corpse on his laboratory table is telling him or her much. The subject's age, possible lifestyle, general health while alive, when and how the person died, and by what means. As Michael M. Baden, M.D., Chief Forensic Pathologist, New York State Police, and former Chief Medical Examiner, New York City, rather eloquently put it, the deceased is communicating with me, and I am a good watcher and listener. Therefore, I think that we should dissect these historic cases in much the same forensic light, and although any individual's behaviour varies with mood and circumstance, if we take good and bad human behaviour collectively, we find common themes and schemes throughout. That is our species' nature, which remains pretty much constant, as have the motives to commit crime throughout the generations. An eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Woe to the wicked! Disaster is upon them. They will be paid back for what their hands have done. Isaiah 3:11. I'm no Bible thumper by any length of chalk. I have never met Mr. Isaiah, who lived at Apt 3:11, yet he does have a point, don't you think? Inter alia, the punishment should fit the guilty act. And I am obliged to say that the crimes in this audiobook were not collected in accordance with the I wants to make your flesh creep ambition of the fat boy in Charles Dickens's The Pickwick Papers, because some are not the most terrible of murders, but in several cases the most extraordinary ones, while others will blow your mind. Neither is this audiobook an annotated catalogue of the Chamber of Horrors, although some of the killers mentioned at some time or another might well have stood as wax effigies for all to see, and made one's flesh creep too. There are killings in this audiobook that have stood the clinical test of time. The sombre annals of murder most foul brightened here and there with such interludes as the total lunacy of Dr. Cream, the obnoxious greed of Dr. John Bodkin Adams, the sinister punctiliousness of Dr. Harold Shipman. We will meet death-dealing nurses Beverly Allett, Lucy Letby, the god-awful Jolly Jane Topham, and Richard Angelo, among others along our way. We will find Keystone Cop-type blunders, dramatic sigh-of-relief acquittals, exhumations aplenty, and some French serial killers that bore the dark shadow of Madame Guillotine, and the so-called hanging judges, pointing the terrified condemned towards Master Gallows. I hope that the point of interest will shift throughout the narrative from the machinations of our doctors and angels of death to the ingenuity of the clued-in or not-so-clued-in detectives, from the unusualness of motive to the singularity of execution, from scenes of domestic life to the last dramatic act of public prosecution. We will travel from place to place, and on the way we will discover there are more than a few pretty in-for-a-penny, in-for-a-pound medical cover-ups too. Honoré de Balzac called his huge series of novels La Comédie Humaine, and within the following pages is the tragic comedy of real life. Stories varied by every conceivable change of scene and circumstance, in village and town, cottage, mansion and slum, from doctors' surgeries to the busy wards of hospitals, all ringing the changes on tragedy, farce, pathos, passion. Our medical characters are morbidly raised to epic proportions by intensity of emotions, walking under the arc lamps of publicity, surrounded, as the last act begins, by all the pomp and circumstance of the law, when they are metaphorically stripped naked to reveal themselves as the detestable little creatures that they truly are. In the following cases of homicide by medically trained people, there is no virtue, nor, as has sometimes been the fashion, Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is an example, any attempt to exalt the criminal, to picture him or her as a person wronged by society, overcoming unjust obstructions by intelligence and daring. Had Fyodor not remembered eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth? Never mind the New Testament advice to turn the other cheek. I'm a tad more old-fashioned on this score. The original "let's not mess about" quote is derived from the Code of Hammurabi, a system of 282 laws organized by the Mesopotamian king Hammurabi, who reigned until 1750 BCE. One of the punishments prescribed in the code was, if a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. This is called mirror punishment, the rule being that retribution must exactly equal the crime. Exodus and Leviticus in the Old Testament, as well as Babylonian law, back this up. And why not, say I? Indeed, after listening to this audiobook, you might have your own opinions about any judgment awarded. I will leave that up to you. These days, and this is only my irascible opinion, you will rightly have your own, which I will respect, many societies have strayed so far towards liberalism that any consideration of the condemnation of wanton takers of human life leans towards dripping wet, hand-wringing, sympathetic leniency, overriding not only the suffering of the victim, but also of their heartbroken kith and kin for the alleged good of us all. For example, many listeners will remember, and continue to associate, the late Lord Longford, primarily with his unpopular campaign to parole the through and through utterly evil Moors murderer, Myra Hindley. But this was, in reality, just one part of a prison's crusade that lasted for 70 years based upon his naive belief that every offender, whatever their crime, could be rehabilitated. Gosh, I bet he would have loved the British serial killer Joanne Dennehy, nurses Allett and Letby and Dr. Shipman, even Peter Sutcliffe, a.k.a. the Yorkshire Ripper, come to that. It is all too easy to imagine his lordship preaching, "Yes, I can fix Pete's deeply ingrained homicidal fake psycho tendencies. He is a good watercolourist. We just need to direct his attention away from bludgeoning and stabbing women to death and give him a half-decent box of paints." There is none of that upside-down, extreme liberal malarkey in this audiobook because a review of the medical rogues gallery that follows creates an entirely different impression. Studies of all evil criminals reveal masks beneath which lie depravity, vanity, secretiveness, meanness, snobbishness, mercilessness, arrogance. Yet in this audiobook I have added many other egocentric people given to donning white coats, stethoscopes around their necks, black bags at hand, nurses bustling around with love in their eyes, murder in their hearts. Soft justice, pink cells and pets, cushy jails she could serve time in. Daily Mail, Tuesday the 22nd of August, 2023, on Nurse Letby. It seems pitiful to me that some of our modern-day medical killer ilk are not prescribed any uncompromising eye-for-an-eye retribution. Okay, I'll tell you why. It's because the likes of British nurses Beverly Allett and Lucy Letby are presently living within the Home Office correctional estate, treated like guests who have just booked into a 4-star hotel and being cosseted with first-rate medical support and a balanced, healthy diet around the fucking clock. That's why. I have visited several Russian prisons. Sablino, about 40 kilometers south of St. Petersburg, springs to mind. I took a TV camera in there. I have previously written of my experiences of and mixed emotions about the harsh reality of the Russian Federation's windswept, isolated women's penal colony that is Sablino. That's precisely where Letby and Allett should be, living in crammed dormitories, hot bunking with the stench of hundreds of cats everywhere. Get them out shoveling snow all day in minus 30 degrees and below, and earning their keep making clear plastic audio cassette cases in a workshop overseen by armed guards with vicious dogs snapping at their heels. Rehabilitation for murdering helpless babies be damned. Correctional BS. I had considered writing to Allett and Letby to ask them if they would like to comment on their serial murders for this book. I got as far as telephoning HMP Low Newton in County Durham, only to be informed, "Just wait a moment, sir. Let me inquire as to Miss Letby's busy schedule." This was followed by a very long wait because initially staff couldn't find her in or on the Home Office prison estate on account of the fact that half of the screws were off sick with the stress of being paid peanuts and obliged to frequent food banks, with the remainder in the canteen with their feet up. Until, wait for it, "I'm sorry to have kept you waiting, sir. Miss Letby is having her hair done in the salon at the moment while she selects a soft pink rinse to match the new bedding and drapes that she's ordered from a magazine at the taxpayer's expense. Perhaps, sir, you could try phoning another day and rack up another hefty phone bill at your expense while we check that she is not having her alternate weekly pedicure/manicure when you call. Thank you for contacting HMP Low Newton." Yes, I know that my editor is going to insist that the aforegoing rant is an exaggeration, and that it makes me seemingly a cold-hearted kind of guy. Hey, what's wrong with some keep-fit rock-breaking exercises being added to the correctional curriculum? Breaking sweat while smashing up granite in a quarry, just like the good old days down at Dartmoor Prison, might be healthily constructive. Of course not. These days, matters arising from health and safety regulations have to be adhered to. God forbid that a con inconveniently drops a hammer on one's toes. And that also prevents making these inherently evil people do some painting and decorating around the place because the outside contractors periodically seem more preoccupied in smuggling in dope and mobile phones to make life inside more con-comfortable for these losers. Of course, I made some of that rant up, as you will have already guessed, but I am sure that you catch my drift. Nevertheless, my critics from the Lord Longford School of Soft Knocks will demand that I be shot, or at the very least, that someone confiscates my PC keyboard, or that I sign up for some forgive all and everyone re-education. Point of fact. Watch how any high-minded reformists do a disgruntled volte-face when someone very close to them has their life snuffed out by a person who should never have been conceived, let alone born in the first instance. So, with a lot gotten off my chest, 'tis true that time and tide wait for no man, nor does Dr. Death. Christopher Berry-Dee, UK and El Nido, Palawan, Philippines. ChristopherBerry-Dee.com. Chapter 1. Dr. Edward William Pritchard. Farewell, brother. I die in 20 hours from this. Romans 8:34-39. Mary Jane, darling mother, and you, I will meet, as you said the last time you spoke to me under happier circumstances. Bless you and yours, prayed the dying penitent. Dr. William Pritchard. Letter prior to his execution. Execution. Starting this chapter on a Shakespearean note by travelling the scene from place to place, the most momentous events of 1865 were the assassination of President Lincoln and the end of the 4-year-long U.S. Civil War. No doubt the present incumbent of the White House could have stopped the war in 5 and 20 minutes with the help of Russia, or do I mean North Korea? In England, the less neurotic and more psychologically balanced side of the pond, the Salvation Army began on the streets of East London when tin-rattling Methodists, Mr. Williams and Mrs. Catherine Booth, abandoned the traditional concept of a church pulpit to take God's word directly to the people. This really upset the traditionalists because it cut out the middleman. Money that might have gone on to some offering plate into a collection box or into a priest's cassock started going into these upstarts' tins. While Sally Ann uniformed musicians played Alas and Did My Saviour Bleed or How Great Thou Art while standing before a Debenhams, founded 1778, shopfront in the pouring rain. Of marginally less interest, 1865 was the year when 24 vessels were wrecked around the Douve Artache Reef off the west coast of Scotland in a storm, and not by coincidence, 165 emigrants left the island of Raasay between the Isle of Skye and the mainland for Australia. Medically speaking, the pioneering surgeon, Joseph Lister, didn't travel down under but started to experiment with antiseptic surgery in Glasgow using carbolic acid. This was also the year that the fourth cholera pandemic reached Scotland. With all that said, something far more important for the public's entertainment caught everyone's fancy: the public execution of Dr. Pritchard. The scene being enacted with all the pomp and circumstance of medieval justice, and throughout the interrogations and processions he bore himself with dignity and courage. It may be said of him, as many another great criminal, that he died better than he lived, ran a lively report in the Edinburgh Evening Courant. Some of us, not necessarily die-hard true crime aficionados, especially those loyal visitors and contributors to the annual CrimeCon UK events in London and Glasgow, might welcome such a spectacle as follows, simply because Dr. Pritchard surely qualified for the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth rule in spades. And why? Because the short drop hanging scene was enacted near to the Salt Market end of Glasgow Green, the event being witnessed by a crowd of nearly 100,000, most of whom had assembled overnight, with some heavy drinking in ale-houses and taverns. It is also correct to say that the long drop had yet to be invented, so the slow, primitive process suffered by Dr. Pritchard would not have been to his liking. Well, it wouldn't, would it? With the condemned strangling to death and the executioner darting beneath the scaffold to pull down on the struggling doctor's kicking legs until he had reached his murderous sell-by date. And this is where, as I promised earlier, historic reportage comes eloquently to the fore. Here is the Edinburgh Evening Courant's ever so eager account of events as they unfolded outside Glasgow's South Jail, verbatim. The scaffold is a large black painted box, the interior of which is about 12 feet square, the sides rising 3 feet above the platform. The height of the beam is about 8 or 9 feet, and the rope was placed so as to let the culprit fall between 3 and 4 feet. The frame of the scaffold is on wheels and is put together for the most part with bolts. The platform is reached by a broad flight of steps. Underneath the scaffold, as usual, a coffin was placed. It was a plain black shell and scarcely long enough for the body it was to contain. Enough, I hear you say. But I say, please remember an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, as the Edinburgh Evening Courant's account continues, before the reporter left the scene, pencil in hand, perhaps repairing to the nearest tavern to file their copy. As the procession came into view of the crowd, there was some jeering, but this slowly died away, and it was in complete silence that Calcraft, the executioner, drew the bolt. Dr. Pritchard appeared to suffer great agony, for he was seen to struggle his shoulders about a dozen times, and only when, after Calcraft had gone beneath the scaffold and straightened his legs, did all movement cease. Gosh, we get none of this riveting press coverage today, do we? Back then, the populace needed something exciting to make their day, and I hope to do the same for my listeners in relating one of the most fascinating cases of medical homicide in all of history. This was to be the last public hanging in Glasgow, although not in Scotland. For the last moments in life, Dr. Pritchard wore his best coat and trousers and his patent leather boots. At 8:10 p.m., he was launched into eternity on the gallows. His body was not cut down for more than 30 minutes after that. What might have pleased him was that some members of the Phrenological Society of Edinburgh had come to take a cast of his head. From their examination, they concluded that the desire to please was his ruling passion, and that he exhibited low cunning and well-developed self-esteem. The history of phrenology goes way back and makes for fascinating study. However, the members of the society who came to measure the doctor's head might have easily determined all of that simply by reading the newspapers, which, it is fair to say, more than comprehensively covered the 3-day trial. In truth, when I began casting around for the first killer to start this book, I realized that not much that is good can be said about Dr. Edward William Pritchard. He self-allegedly loved his children, but that love didn't extend to their mother and grandmother. He met his death with dignity, but he was a braggart, a hypocrite, and one of the cruelest medical murderers in the dark annals of crime. Born in Southsea, Hampshire, into a naval family with his father John White Pritchard holding the rank of captain, Pritchard's ambition had always been to become popular like his father, yet he left behind a record the infamy of which is, even today, not wholly forgotten, for different types of murder merit different degrees of censure. Murder by poison, which requires forethought and preparation, is the most infamous, yet even among poisoners there must be precedents. Someone who murders by administering a single fatal dose may well object to being ranked with one who destroys a victim by slow torture, for gradual poisoning is the most subtle, perhaps the most artistic method of killing. The continent has produced many brilliant masters of this evil craft, but the acknowledged leader, one might say the founder, of the British school of poisoning was Dr. Edward William Pritchard, he being a kind of Hippocratic oath-keeper in reverse. Also of interest to us is the fact that Pritchard has other claims to immortality. He committed his long-drawn-out homicidal spree for absolutely no discoverable reason. Even the prosecution at trial could not allege an adequate motive. This fact alone makes his case somewhat unusual, but when we consider motive in its purest sense, well, we all have different reasons for doing things to satisfy our needs. We should, perhaps, look a bit harder into Pritchard's narrative. Early days. Physicians have a unique place in society, although I will not labour too long on Dr. Pritchard, a.k.a. the human crocodile, from the fake tears he shed at trial, because we have many other murdering doctors' and nurses' heads to delve into. It is enough to say that although his trial took place in Scotland, England must bear the responsibility for his birth. His parents were of sufficient means and social standing to ensure that Edward received a sound education. He claimed to have graduated at King's College Hospital in 1846 and then, no doubt with a copy of the Hippocratic Oath in his pocket, joined the Royal Navy and served as an assistant surgeon on HMS Victory, Nelson's flagship at the Battle of Trafalgar more than 40 years earlier. She is still in service with the Royal Navy today. According to him, he spent another 4 years on board various naval vessels, sailing extensively across the Pacific to Egypt and through the Arctic. Returning to Portsmouth aboard HMS Hecate, a wooden 4-gun Hydra-class paddle sloop fitted out for survey work, he met Mary Jane Taylor, daughter of Michael Taylor, a retired silk and lace merchant who resided at the Grange, 22 Minto Street, Edinburgh. The house still stands. The couple married in 1851, having 5 children, of whom the oldest was 13 at the time of Pritchard's trial. We find him next having resigned from the Royal Navy and in general practice in Hunmanby, Yorkshire, in 1859. He published several books about his travels and on the water cure, hydrotherapy or hydropathy, as well as articles in the Lancet. Through his connection with the Taylors, Pritchard moved to Glasgow, where he lived at various addresses, and from Whit Sunday 1864, the 15th of May, in Clarence Place, then part of Sauchiehall Street. There, he succeeded in getting together a respectable medical practice, although it would be fair to say that his financial position was never on a firm footing. He was, usually, in debt. Nonetheless, through his contributions to the newspapers on such topics as cancer, gout, a sprinkling of Hippocrates' thinking on the influence of vegetable medicines, and an apple a day upon diseases, he achieved the street cred of a man of culture, a reputation that was enhanced by the active part he played in Glasgow's social life. From here onwards, however, things started sailing south. Travel makes you a great storyteller, Fijian saying. Dr. Pritchard was a prominent Mason, meaning that he was on the square, although his morals were anything but. He was a director of the Glasgow Athenaeum, an institution founded in 1847 to provide courses in commerce, languages, music, and the fine arts, and won considerable fame by giving lectures in the library there about his voyages. It would appear, however, that his tongue had travelled even farther than the rest of him. To cite one example, his descriptions of Fiji were never the same twice and possessed only one common feature, namely a complete lack of resemblance to the real islands. One gem from those lectures has been preserved and must be quoted because it illustrates the boastful, figurative style of speech affected by Dr. Pritchard. I have plucked the eaglets from their eyries in the deserts of Arabia and hunted the Nubian lion in the prairies of North America. All of which remarkable account must have been seasoned heavily with bullshit. That said, however, many supposedly clever people bought into him hook, line, and sinker, so he would have made for a typical politician today. Another illuminating story about Pritchard deserves telling. At one time he professed a prodigious admiration for the Italian soldier, revolutionary, and patriot Giuseppe Garibaldi, who was then at the height of his powers. Garibaldi was one of the great men of the 19th century and also a remarkably successful general and naval commander, which, in Pritchard's mind, ripened in the course of a week or so into a self-alleged warm personal friendship. In order to quicken his regard for his hero, Pritchard presented himself with a walking stick with the following legend, "To Edward William Pritchard, from his friend General Garibaldi." Naturally, the latter would not have known the doctor had he thrown himself prostrate at his feet. Incidentally, if you like something to nibble with your tea, the Garibaldi, or less appealingly squashed fly biscuit, was invented by Peake Freen and Company of London in 1861, the Italian having visited Tyneside in 1854. He would return to Britain and a hero's welcome 10 years later. Well, life would be much duller if one didn't learn something trivial but amusing every day, wouldn't it? A medical charlatan in the making. Lying is an indispensable part of making life tolerable. Bergen Baldwin Evans, 1904 to 1978, U.S. academic and TV host. As we travel through more of this doctor's narrative, we learn that he subsequently elaborated his spurious Garibaldi relationship and tried to restore his waning professional credibility by writing fake testimonials to himself from eminent London doctors who, like Garibaldi, had never heard of him either. Pritchard's chief ambition in life was to be admired by his peers. A harmless enough vanity, we might agree, had there been anything of worth to support it. But as has already been shown, the means that he employed to achieve this end were as ludicrous as they were patently inadequate. As all my listeners will understand by now, Dr. Pritchard flattered and bragged and lied to pretty much everyone with whom he fell into acquaintance. He even caused his photograph to be advertised by all the Glasgow stationers and sold at considerably less than cost price in order that the humblest might be able to secure a memento of the eminent doctor, explorer, and friend of Garibaldi. In contemporary times we might call this a marketing loss leader, so it's no wonder that Pritchard was mostly broke. How many people did he murder? In the overall scheme of things, we might consider him a serial killer lightweight, for he sent to their graves only his wife and his mother-in-law by poisoning them with antimony. The Pritchard household at 131 Sauchiehall Street consisted of Dr. and Mrs. Pritchard, 4 of their children, a cook and a nurse housemaid, 16-year-old Mary MacLeod. Mrs. Pritchard became unwell in October 1864, but it was significant that her health improved when she went back to her parents' home at 1 Lauder Road, Edinburgh, for a month at the end of the year. Back in Glasgow, having now recuperated, her symptoms reappeared, at that time mainly sickness after meals. She was seldom able to eat with the family, and food was sent or taken to her room by Dr. Pritchard, although on occasion it was carried up by Mary MacLeod. Her first serious attack of illness came in February 1865, this time pain and cramp as well as sickness. She was seen by 2 doctors. One did not consider her case to be serious, while the other prescribed a simple diet and recommended without success that she be removed to the care of her brother, a doctor in Penrith. Never in this world. On the 10th of February 1865, Pritchard's mother-in-law, 70-year-old Jane Taylor, came to Glasgow to look after her daughter. She never returned alive to Edinburgh. 3 days later, Jane fell sick after taking some tapioca, remarking with far greater insight than she knew that she must be suffering from the same complaint as her daughter. On the 24th of February, she became ill. Her son-in-law called in a neighbour, Dr. James Patterson, who had been in practice for more than 30 years and until recently had been Professor of Midwifery at Glasgow's Andersonian University. When Dr. Patterson arrived, Pritchard remarked that his mother-in-law had fallen from a chair and added that she was in the habit of taking a drop. They then went to the bedroom in which Jane was lying, fully dressed. Dr. Patterson was later to tell the trial court that he had expressed the opinion that she was dying under the influence of a powerful narcotic. Pritchard clapped her on the shoulder, saying, "You are getting better, darling," to which the other doctor remarked, "Never in this world." Pritchard then told Patterson that his mother-in-law was in the habit of taking Batley's solution of opium, which could be bought over the counter in those days, and that it was highly probable that she had taken a good swig at it. Poor Jane Taylor died on the 28th of February 1865, having survived just 18 days in her son-in-law's household. Shortly thereafter, Mary Pritchard's condition declined further. Servants noticed the horrible taste or burning sensation produced by food that was intended for her. Cheese on the 13th of March, egg flip 2 days later. On the 17th of March, she took a severe turn for the worst and became light-headed after her husband was seen to have given her something to drink. Dr. Patterson was called in during the evening and found that her condition had taken an alarming turn for the worse. After dictating a prescription, he left. About 1 a.m., Mary Pritchard, aged only 38, died while the servants were preparing a mustard poultice. 2 days later, Dr. Pritchard certified the cause of death as gastric fever, its duration 2 months. That same day, he accompanied the body of his wife to Edinburgh for its interment beside that of her mother in the Grange Cemetery. In a macabre twist, at his request, the coffin was opened at the tailor's house, and he kissed his dead wife on the lips, exhibiting, we are told, a great deal of feeling. As he stepped off the train at Queen Street Station in Glasgow on his return from the funeral, however, he was arrested. This followed the receipt by the Procurator Fiscal, the Scots term for a public prosecutor, of an anonymous letter pointing to the suspicious circumstances in which mother and daughter had died, a letter most likely sent by Dr. Patterson. The question of motive. So what were the issues at the trial? Where Mary Pritchard was concerned, it was not in dispute that she had died from chronic poisoning by antimony. Her body was impregnated with it. 10 grams were recovered from her liver and intestines. The Crown's case was that Dr. Pritchard had the means, the opportunity and the skill set to administer this toxic substance. He had made considerable purchases of antimony and other poisons, more than were required by an ordinary medical practitioner. And, as we have seen in this narrative, he had also frequently indulged in gratuitous falsehoods, so that any motive he gave for the murders had to be taken with a pinch of salt at best. The defence maintained that it was too improbable that Dr. Pritchard would have wanted to poison his wife, having regard to his position, his education, and his so-called affection for her. It was no use suggesting that she had been poisoned by one of the cooks, because the poisoning started before one of them came, and continued after the other one left the household. Hence the defence introduced the suggestion that the guilt lay with Mary MacLeod, who had been the nurse housemaid since Whit Sunday, 24th of May, 1863. As regards the elderly Jane Taylor, there was a dispute over the cause of her death. The Crown maintained that she died as a result of the combined effect of antimony, aconite, and opium, the latter being due to taking Batley's solution. Antimony and aconite were found in the last bottle of Batley's that she had used. The defence, realising that they were backing the losing horse, did not offer any medical evidence, merely suggesting that she had died from the effects of opium alone. The plot thickens. We have firmly established who done it, where Dr. Pritchard done it, and how he done it, but there seems to be no real motive to be found anywhere. Or is there? Predating the double murders of his mother-in-law and his wife, Pritchard had been suspected of murdering a 25-year-old servant girl named Elizabeth McGrain. On the 5th of May, 1863, a fire started in her room in the Pritchards' house at 11 Berkeley Terrace, Glasgow, but it seems that she made no attempt to escape, suggesting that she was unconscious, drugged, or already dead. Dr. Pritchard was never tried for this crime. I suggest that his wife had held grave suspicions over her husband's alleged fidelity following Elizabeth's death, and that this was reinforced when the doctor personally hired the freckle-faced 16-year-old Mary MacLeod, who had come from Islay, the southernmost island of the Inner Hebrides. The young woman said in evidence that in 1863 Pritchard had given her a ring and seduced her. In May of the following year she found herself pregnant with his child. He said that he would put it right, she told the jury, a euphemism, no doubt, for an abortion, which he carried out. Needless to say, their liaison continued thereafter, including during the time when Pritchard's wife became ill and was in Edinburgh. Mary MacLeod also testified that before Mrs. Pritchard had fallen ill, the 38-year-old doctor spoke to her about marrying her, but did not say more. When pressed, Mary said that Pritchard had told her that he would marry her if his wife died before him. In 1865, he had given Mary a brooch and a locket containing his photograph, and admitted that he and she had been seen by his wife kissing in a bedroom. Mary wanted to go away, but Mrs. Pritchard would not let her, saying that she would speak to the doctor, who was a nasty, dirty man. This had been in the summer of 1864. So now we have at least a motive for the wicked and felonious deaths of two women. A second possible motive for murder was financial gain. It was true that Pritchard was short of money and getting along by the seat of his pants. Mrs. Taylor's will was to leave him a life rent in 2/3 of £2,500 until the children came of age. In Scots law, a life rent is a right to receive for life the benefits of a property or other asset without the right to dispose of or destroy it. Yet during his trial no evidence was presented that Pritchard knew of the will. In any event, he was an idol in her eyes. At least this is what he claimed, and was probably more valuable to him alive than dead, as a source of future loans, it has to be said. For my part, although we will never know what exactly was in Pritchard's mind, I follow William Ruffhead's thinking, the chronicler of Pritchard's trial and many others. Ruffhead thought that the man in the dock had tired of his wife and found her continued existence incompatible with the free pursuit of a lawless pastime. The listener will remember this quote, cited above, by Bergen Baldwin Evans. Lying is an indispensable part of making life tolerable. So it is interesting to consider that during his time in prison, Pritchard admitted his guilt, not just on one occasion, but with 3 separate confessions, each conflicting with the other. One, that he had murdered his wife by an overdose of chloroform when Mary MacLeod was present, and that Mary was aware that the food she took to his wife was poisoned. 2, that he had given his wife the chloroform at her own earnest request. He believed that his mother-in-law had died through an overdose of Batley's opium solution, and after her death he had put aconite in the bottle, in order to prove death by misadventure in case any inquiry should take place. Although highly poisonous, aconite was used in some medical treatments. He added that his wife had been aware of his misconduct with young Mary, and rather sought to cover my wickedness and folly. During the fortnight when Mrs. Taylor was nursing her daughter, she had caught him with Mary in the consulting room. 3. Perhaps as a result of the labours of ministers of the church who had wrestled with his reluctance to come to terms with the truth, Pritchard accepted that he had murdered both women and that Mrs. Taylor's death had been caused in the manner set out in the charge against him. As to his motive, he could not assign any beyond a species of terrible madness and the use of ardent spirits, strong drink. Is there another doctor in the house? Before I close this chapter on Pritchard, I must draw listeners' attention to a remarkable lecture. Some Reflections on the Case of Dr. Pritchard, given by the distinguished Scottish judge Lord William Cullen of Whitekirk at Parliament House, Edinburgh in 1998. Here, attention is drawn back to Dr. Patterson to encounter a case within a case, as Lord Cullen relates. In short, during and after the trial, Dr. Patterson came in for a great deal of criticism for not having at least tried to intervene when he first realised that Jane Taylor was under the influence of opium and was dying, more so because lying next to her was her daughter, Mary Pritchard, in a state of pitiful agitation and distress. Giving his evidence, Patterson said that Mrs. Pritchard seemed to be exceedingly weak and exhausted, her features sharp and thin with a high, hectic flush, her voice very weak and peculiar, as if she was verging on the collapsed state of cholera, her countenance conveying the idea of a semi-imbecile. He said that he could not rid his mind of the idea, or rather the conviction, that she was under the depressing influence of antimony. In cross-examination, he said that his impression was that she was being poisoned by its long-continued administration. In re-examination, Patterson proved to be even more definite. He believed that somebody was administering antimony to her for the purpose of procuring her death. He went on to say that he saw her twice more before her death on the 18th of March. Lord Cullen writes, on the 3rd of March, Dr. Patterson visited her as a result, he said, of a chance meeting with Pritchard. Her symptoms and his opinions were unchanged. It was more like a friend's call of condolence because he understood that Dr. Pritchard was attending Mary. However, Patterson left a prescription for champagne, brandy and ice, etc. When he was called in by Pritchard on the 17th, he was very much struck by her terribly altered appearance and particularly by her wild expression. This time Patterson prescribed morphia, wine, chlorodyne and cinnamon water. At this point we come to the crux of it all, for a number of searching questions were then asked of Patterson. Why had he not told Pritchard of his concern? Faced with that pointed question in cross-examination, he weakly replied, "It would not have been a very safe matter to do that." Asked in re-examination to explain that answer, he said that this would not have been very natural. Asked whether his suspicions concerned Pritchard, he said that he would rather not answer the question, even though he knew that Mary Pritchard was literally dying in excruciating pain from toxic poisoning in front of his very eyes. Trying to dodge more bullets, he replied when asked why he had not told Mrs. Pritchard. Because the treatment I prescribed for her, provided she got nothing else, was quite sufficient, in my opinion. Why had he not gone back to see her? She was not my patient. It is the etiquette of our profession that the consultant has no right to go back to see the patient. Why had he not told the authorities? There was another doctor in the house. I did my best by apprising the registrar, by refusing to certify the death, to which the Lord Justice Clerk himself delivered a scathing rebuke. I care not for professional etiquette or professional rule. There is a rule of life, and a consideration that is far higher than these, and that is the duty that every right-minded man owes to his neighbour to prevent the destruction of human life in this world, and in that duty I cannot but say that Dr. Patterson failed. There is no doubt that Patterson deserved this censure. While he may have done no medical harm either to Jane Taylor or Mary Pritchard, his failure to act on his suspicions, on the evidence before his eyes, undoubtedly breached his duty under the Hippocratic Oath. Lord Cullen adds a ghoulish postscript. In 1910, when the workmen were digging in the foundations of the old South Jail, they came across a grave over which lay a slab with the letters WWP. The body was examined, and once more the skull was the subject of scientific examination. The corpse still wore patent leather boots which, unlike Dr. Pritchard's reputation, were in a perfect state of preservation. I could never have ended any chapter better than that. Note: for further reading, report of the trial of Dr. Pritchard for murder, trial at the High Court of Judiciary, Edinburgh, before the Lord Chief Justice Clerk, Lord Ardmillan and Lord Jerviswood, on the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th and 7th of July, 1865, Edinburgh. Oliver and Boyd, 1865.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.